The engine does not fail dramatically. It does not seize in the middle of a field during peak harvest with the crop standing and the weather closing in. The way engine failures appear in the version of this story that gets told afterward to make the decision that follows seem more inevitable than it actually was. It fails the way most engines fail on working farms, which is gradually and then completely, over the course of a season and a half, of increasingly clear signals that a man who knows his machine well enough can read without any diagnostic equipment. Signals that communicate the same message in progressively less ambiguous language until the final morning when the engine turns over 3 times, catches briefly, and then stops in a way that is different from all the previous mornings when it started correctly. A finality in the mechanical sound that tells the man sitting in the cab before he has checked a single gauge or opened a single access panel that the conversation between him and this engine is over. Ed Vogt has been farming the same 600 acres in the same county for 26 years. The Massey Ferguson 3090 he is sitting in when the engine makes that final sound has been on his farm for 19 of those years, purchased used at a price that fit inside the budget of a mid-career grain farmer who was not yet in the financial position to buy new, and who understood enough about the 3090's mechanical reputation to know that used, properly maintained, was a defensible choice rather than a compromise. Ed has maintained it properly. The service records in the binder on the shelf above his workbench document every oil change, every filter replacement, every hydraulic service, every seasonal inspection across 19 years, in Ed's handwriting, on dated pages, with parts lot numbers noted alongside the service descriptions in the meticulous way of a man who believes that a machine's history is as important as its current condition, and that knowing the history completely is what allows you to trust the current condition without reservation. The binder is thick. The machine has been trusted. What the binder cannot prevent is the accumulation of hours on an engine block that was already used when Ed purchased the machine 19 years ago, and that has now reached the point where the internal wear has moved past the threshold that careful maintenance can manage and into the territory that only a major rebuild or a replacement engine can address. The compression numbers that Ed's service technician checked the previous autumn were low enough that both men looked at the results without saying anything for a moment before the technician wrote his recommendation in the inspection report, which was that the engine required either a full rebuild or replacement before the following season if the machine was going to continue as a primary field tractor. Ed took the report home and put it on the kitchen table and sat with it for 3 evenings before he had a clear picture of what the options actually looked like and what each of them cost. A factory rebuild of the Perkins engine in the 3090, performed by a qualified shop with correct components, would cost a number that was real and significant, but not impossible. Ed got 2 quotes. Both quotes came back in a range that was high enough to make Ed compare the result against the current market value of the machine and find that he would be spending more on the rebuild than the machine would be worth when the rebuild was complete, which is the arithmetic that makes rebuilds economically indefensible on older equipment and that results in a lot of serviceable machines being retired from working farm life because the cost of restoring them to working condition exceeds the value the market assigns to their working condition. The arithmetic is not wrong. It is simply the arithmetic of a market that prices machines on age and hours and brand perception rather than on the specific and granular knowledge of a particular machine's history and actual mechanical condition that the man who has maintained it for 19 years possesses. A new engine, either a factory remanufactured Perkins unit or an aftermarket equivalent, would cost less than the rebuild quotes, but more than Ed's operating account could absorb in a single transaction without creating the kind of cash flow constraint that a grain farmer going into a planting season cannot afford to carry. The lead time on both engine options, according to the parts suppliers Ed contacted, was running at 8 to 12 weeks from order to delivery, which placed the earliest possible installation date at the outer edge of the window before spring field work would begin, and which required Ed to either order immediately before he had fully evaluated the alternatives, or to accept the risk of a delayed planting start if the installation ran long. The third option is the one that Ed arrives at not through a systematic analysis of alternatives, but through a conversation at a machinery consignment sale in February, where he is looking at a row of parted-out equipment and talking to the man running the sale about what is available and at what prices. The man mentions a John Deere 6059 diesel engine that came out of a tractor with a destroyed final drive, an engine that the consignment man has had sitting in his warehouse for 4 months because the market for used John Deere engines is narrower than he anticipated when he pulled it, and that he is motivated to move at a price that reflects 4 months of warehouse storage and diminishing enthusiasm for the asset. Ed asks about the engine's condition. The consignment man pulls the documentation he received with the engine, which includes a compression test result performed by the shop that removed it and a visual inspection report that notes no internal damage indicators. Ed looks at the numbers. He knows enough about diesel engine specifications to understand that the 6059 is a different engine than the Perkins in the 3090, but that it is not a fundamentally different category of engine, that the displacement is comparable, that the power output is within a range that the 3090's drivetrain can manage, and that the physical installation is going to require fabrication work, but is not going to require anything that is beyond the capability of a man with a well-equipped machine shed and 26 years of working on his own equipment. He buys the engine for a number that is significantly below any of the other options he has been pricing, loads it on his trailer, and drives home, with the particular combination of determination and uncertainty that accompanies a decision that you know is going to require more from you than you can fully estimate at the point of making it. He does not tell anyone immediately. He puts the engine in the shed and looks at both engines, the failed Perkins in the tractor and the John Deere 6059 on the shop floor, and begins the assessment that will tell him whether the idea that seemed manageable at the consignment sale remains manageable when the two engines are in the same room and the specific dimensions of the adaptation problem are visible rather than theoretical. The assessment takes a week. Ed measures everything that matters for the installation: the engine mount geometry, the bell housing configuration, the crankshaft flange dimensions that determine whether the existing flywheel and clutch assembly can be adapted or must be replaced, the accessory drive locations that determine where the hydraulic pump and the alternator will live in the new configuration, the cooling system connections, and the exhaust routing. He makes drawings, not engineering drawings in any formal sense, but the working drawings of a man who thinks spatially and who needs to see the adaptation problem on paper before he can evaluate whether the fabrication solutions it requires are within his capability. After a week of measuring and drawing and sitting with the drawings in the evenings, Ed concludes that the adaptation is possible. It is not simple. It requires a custom engine mount fabrication, a bell housing adapter plate machined to mate the John Deere block's rear face to the 3090's transmission input, a modified cooling system routing to accommodate the different coolant connection locations on the 6059, and a custom exhaust manifold adaptation to fit the engine's exhaust port configuration to the 3090's existing exhaust system. None of these are trivial fabrications. All of them are within the range of what Ed's shop, his skills, and the machinist 2 towns over who has done work for Ed before can accomplish. He starts the fabrication in the second week of February and works on it through every available hour until the third week of March, which is when the ground conditions and the planting calendar begin to compete with the shop time that the installation requires. The engine mount fabrication takes 4 days of measuring, cutting, welding, checking, and re-welding until the geometry is correct and the engine sits in the frame at the right height and angle for the drivetrain alignment to work. The bell housing adapter plate is the most technically demanding single component in the entire installation, requiring dimensional accuracy that Ed's shop equipment can approach but not guarantee, which is why he takes his measurements to the machinist 2 towns over and spends 2 hours at the machinist's bench going over the drawing before the machinist agrees to make the plate. The plate comes back in 5 days, correct to the dimensions Ed specified, and it mates to both the engine block and the transmission bell housing with the fit that the drawing required. Ed installs it and feels the satisfaction of a fabrication problem solved through precision rather than through the adjustments and compromises that imprecise fabrication always requires. The cooling system modification takes 3 days of cutting and fitting and fabricating the transition pieces that connect the 6059's coolant passages to the 3090's radiator and cooling circuit. The exhaust adaptation takes 2 days. By the time Ed is ready to attempt the first start, the third week of March has arrived, and the fields outside the shed are approaching the soil temperature and moisture conditions that will require him to be in them rather than in the shed. He sets a Saturday for the first start attempt, which gives him a full day to deal with whatever the first attempt reveals without the pressure of a weekday schedule, competing with the diagnostic work that a first start on a modified installation always requires. The engine starts on the second attempt. Ed does not consider this a minor outcome. He considers it the result of careful preparation and correct fabrication and the particular attention he gave to the fuel system priming and the lubrication pre-fill that a first start on a newly installed engine requires if the engine is going to be given the best possible conditions for its initial operation. The engine idles roughly for the first 3 minutes, which is expected from a cold start on an engine that has been sitting for 4 months, and that is working through its initial lubrication distribution to all the components that the pre-fill did not fully reach. The roughness smooths, the temperature climbs normally, the oil pressure is correct, the cooling system shows no leaks at any of the adaptation joints, which is the outcome Ed was least certain about, given the number of custom connections the cooling system modification required. He lets the engine run for 45 minutes, watching every indicator, listening for any sound that does not belong in the acoustic profile of a correctly operating engine. And at the end of 45 minutes, he shuts it down and goes through every connection and every joint and every seal for evidence of any problem that the instruments did not reveal. He finds nothing that requires immediate attention. He makes notes in the farm journal about what he observed and what he will check after the first field operation hours have accumulated. He takes the tractor to the Massey Ferguson dealership the following Tuesday, which is the visit that changes the social dimension of the entire project in a way that Ed did not fully anticipate when he was working alone in his shed, focused on the mechanical problem. He is not there to show the dealer what he has done. He is there because he needs a specific seal kit for the 3090's hydraulic system, a component that has nothing to do with the engine swap, and that he would have ordered in the normal course of his pre-season service work, regardless of what had happened with the engine. He pulls the tractor into the dealership's service yard and goes inside to the parts counter and gives the parts man the 3090's serial number and the part number for the seal kit, which he has looked up in his parts reference before coming. The parts man keys the information into his system and then looks up from the screen at Ed with the expression of a man who has just seen something in the system that he is not sure how to handle and who is buying himself a moment by looking at the customer before he says what he is about to say. The parts man asks Ed to wait and goes to the service manager's office. The conversation that happens in that office takes 8 minutes, which Ed spends standing at the parts counter, aware that the conversation is about him and his tractor, and that it is not heading toward a straightforward parts transaction. The service manager comes out of his office and introduces himself to Ed, who has met him before across the parts counter in the course of 19 years of buying Massey Ferguson components for his 3090. And the service manager says something that Ed will think about for the rest of that season and for several seasons after it. He says that the dealership has a policy against supplying parts for Massey Ferguson equipment that has been modified with non-Massey Ferguson components, in a way that affects the machine's primary operating systems, and that the engine swap Ed has performed places his 3090 in a category that the dealership cannot support through its normal parts and service channels because the machine's modified configuration creates liability and warranty complications that the dealership's agreement with the manufacturer does not accommodate. He says this professionally and without personal animosity, and with the careful language of a man delivering a policy position that he did not personally design and that he may or may not personally agree with, but that he is responsible for communicating and enforcing as the service manager of this specific franchise location. Ed asks whether this means the dealership will not sell him hydraulic seal kits for the 3090's hydraulic system, which has not been modified and which is the same hydraulic system that was in the machine before the engine swap, and that uses the same components it has always used. The service manager says that the dealership's position applies to the machine as a whole rather than to individual systems within the machine, and that supplying parts for any system on a machine with a non-standard primary power source creates the complications he described. Ed asks what those complications are specifically. The service manager explains that the manufacturer's parts warranty, which applies to components sold through franchise dealers, requires that the components be installed in machines operating within the manufacturer's specifications, and that a machine with a non-OEM engine installed is not operating within those specifications, which means that any part sold for that machine and later found to have failed could be subject to warranty claim complications that the dealership cannot expose itself to. Ed listens to all of this. He does not argue. He says he understands the dealership's position and he leaves without the seal kit. He drives back to the farm and sits in the truck in the lane for a few minutes before going inside. The practical problem of the seal kit is solvable. The same seals are available through aftermarket suppliers, and in fact, through the same regional agricultural parts distributors that supply the dealership itself at a lower price than the dealership's retail parts countercharges. The seal kit problem is not the actual problem. The actual problem, which Ed understands sitting in his truck in the lane, is that the dealership's position is going to be known in the community by Thursday, which is how long it takes for information of that kind to travel through the informal networks of a rural county where the dealership's service manager plays golf with 3 farmers who each talk to 6 others. By Thursday, everyone who operates a Massey Ferguson tractor in the county is going to know that Ed Vogt put a John Deere engine in his MF and got turned away at the parts counter. And the interpretations of that fact are going to range from admiring to dismissive to something considerably less charitable. And Ed is going to have to farm through all of those interpretations while running a machine that he built himself from 2 different manufacturers. Components, and that has not yet been tested through a full season of primary field work. The planting season begins the first week of April, and the tractor performs correctly through every field operation that the planting calendar requires of it. The John Deere engine pulls the planter with the same draft response that the Perkins provided before it began its final decline, which is the comparison that matters most to Ed as an operator who knows exactly what the machine felt like under load before the engine problem developed, and who has the specific sensory reference to evaluate whether the replacement engine is delivering comparable performance. It is. The power delivery is smooth. The engine temperature runs at the lower end of the normal operating range, which Ed attributes to the 6059's larger displacement relative to the Perkins and its correspondingly lower thermal load at the draft levels his planting operation requires. The fuel consumption per acre tracks within 5% of his historical baseline for this field operation, which is close enough given the engine is still in its break-in period and has not yet developed the friction characteristics of a fully broken-in engine that would allow a direct efficiency comparison. The social dimension develops the way Ed anticipated it would, which is through the particular combination of public skepticism and private curiosity that rural communities apply to unconventional decisions made by people they have known for a long time. At the elevator, at the co-op, At the fuel stop on the county road, where the morning coffee crowd assembles with the informal regularity of people who have been meeting in the same place for decades, the conversation about Ed's tractor has the quality of a topic that everyone has an opinion on, and that the opinions divide along lines that have more to do with each person's general orientation toward conventional versus unconventional approaches than with any specific technical knowledge of what Ed has actually done and whether it is likely to work. The men who have always admired Ed's mechanical capability say he probably knows what he is doing. The men who identify strongly with brand loyalty say that putting a John Deere engine in a Massey Ferguson is the kind of thing you do when you do not respect either machine. The men who are primarily interested in economics say the question is whether it works, and they say this in the tone of people who will reserve their full verdict until the harvest numbers provide evidence that cannot be argued with. The dealer situation produces its own secondary conversation because the community's response to a franchise dealer refusing to sell parts to a longtime customer is not uniformly sympathetic to the dealer's position. Several farmers who have had their own frustrations with dealership policies over the years express their opinions about the decision in terms that are considerably less measured than the service manager's professional language, and a few of them make a point of telling Ed directly that they consider the dealership's position unreasonable in a way that they intend to remember at their next equipment purchasing decision. Ed does not encourage this reaction and does not discourage it. He says that the dealership has its policies and that he has his parts suppliers and that the situation is manageable, which is the response of a man who does not want his mechanical decision to become a community grievance on his behalf, and who understands that the people most loudly expressing outrage about the parts counter situation are not the people who are going to help him if something goes wrong with the installation in the middle of the August corn. The cultivation and spray seasons pass without mechanical incident.